Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. This podcast is sponsored by ED Care. ED Care has provided PHP, IOP, and outpatient treatment for all genders 18 and over since 2001. CAMSA, which stands for Connection, Acceptance, Mindfulness, Sense of Self, and Action, is ED Care's mindfulness-based treatment approach and is incorporated into each individualized treatment plan. Facilities are located in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Kansas City, and all treatment is supported by master's level clinicians or higher. ED Care offers 4 specialty tracks for binge eating disorder, elite athletes, substance use, and trauma. And the Connections House, an affordable supportive housing component, adds an extra layer of supervised support. Visit eatingdisorder.care or call 866-771-0861. Dr. Guido Frank is a clinician researcher who uses functional brain imaging to better integrate research and clinical work. His goal is to develop better treatments for eating disorders based on this research. Dr. Frank is board certified in adult as well as child and adolescent psychiatry. In addition, he received extensive formal training in psychotherapy and training in biological brain research. He has been NIMH funded since 2008. His combination of clinical and research training gives him a unique perspective on psychiatric disorders and treatment, taking into account all aspects of past and current experience together with potential biological underpinnings. This fosters a neuroscience-based approach to treatment. His utmost goal in this work is to improve the quality of life of the individual as well as the family system that a patient is embedded in. This starts with an empathic approach, careful assessment, thoughtful recommendation of treatment options, and providing the family with the collaborative experience that their feedback is always welcome and that treatment is happening in a collaborative manner and taking in all aspects of importance, including culture-specific experiences and attitudes into account. Dr. Frank's extensive training in psychotherapy has always given him a special background to connect with and treat his patients in that way. One of my psychotherapy teachers once said that every patient has the right to be convinced that the treatment the clinician offers is appropriate and likely to be of help. He has always worked with families in that spirit and believes this makes it easier, especially when it is about biology and medication treatment for families to engage in the treatment process. A special emphasis of Dr. Frank's is always that a child or adolescent is involved as much as possible in the decision-making process and takes ownership of the treatment. So Dr. Frank is both a renowned researcher as well as a psychiatrist who works in the treatment setting. Please help me welcome Dr. Guido Frank. Dr. Frank, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm excited to talk about your different career endeavors and especially about the research and the neuroscience of eating disorder recovery. So will you tell us about your background and training and education and what you're currently doing with your research?
I'm an associate professor in psychiatry and neuroscience at the University of Colorado, the Anschutz Medical Campus. I work clinically at Children's Hospital Colorado and run a research group that is particularly interested in neurobiology. And my background, aside from being a psychiatrist, is I was extensively trained in psychotherapy in the past. I worked at a psychosomatic hospital, it is called, in Germany. So my perspective is, I think, quite unbiased. So I have treated folks with psychotherapy, I've treated folks with medications and everything in between. And that shapes my focus towards a research that tries to bridge those two fields. And really, I want to bridge what you see in the clinical presentation, how somebody presents in the office with what we find in the lab and what we find in our brain imaging studies, and then bring that back into the clinical care world.
So important because that gap can be wide unintentionally, but necessary to bridge it. What kinds of research questions have you been working on lately?
So eating disorders are really difficult to treat, as we all know, and really difficult to recover from. And one of my goals is to find biological mechanisms that interfere with psychotherapy. And I'm really interested in developing biological treatments that make psychotherapy more effective. For instance, I'm working on understanding how the drive for thinness, food restriction, and weight loss interacts with how the body changes and how the body adapts to that state, and whether maybe this adaptation becomes a problem for the course of recovery. So it interferes sort of with the psychotherapeutic process.
Yeah. So before we get into that, because I'd love for you to talk about some of the findings that you've had recently or kind of fill us in on the background of the area of research that you tend to work in. But before we get to those more detailed things, how did you get involved in eating disorder treatment and research? How'd you find your way there?
So the truth is it was entirely by chance.
That's an answer that's really common.
After medical school, I thought it would be very interesting to work in this psychosomatic hospital just south of Munich that I mentioned. And I started working with folks with eating disorders. And I have always enjoyed working in that field. I think folks have so much energy, and it's really a joy working with those folks. Although it's also very difficult to bring people back on a healthier path. But that's really where it started. And then I was for a long time interested in biological research, and then I joined Walt Kay's lab in Pittsburgh and learned a lot of techniques and how to analyze data. And then over the past, I want to say, 10, 20 years, psychology and neuroscience have made incredible progress in how we understand the brain, and in particular also around eating and appetite, satiety, and so forth. So it became for me a very tangible system to study, and it's very exciting for me to be in that field.
Yeah, I think that the research is so interesting, and it's interesting to me as somebody who is a clinician to see when the research demonstrates or mirrors back something that we experience clinically to be true, and to just see it on the level of analysis that you look at, which is very detailed in the neuroscience of it all. So I know this is a big question, but if you could tell us a bit about what happens to a brain during an eating disorder.
So there are lots of things happening in terms of neuroendocrine changes, the gut hormone changes, and the brain neurotransmitters change and adapt. But maybe I can take one step further. Mm-hmm. And if you're interested, I can just integrate that sort of with the psychological aspects.
Yeah, go for it.
That you may see. So what always struck me and still strikes me is to, let's say, get into anorexia nervosa that can happen in very different ways, such as somebody hears in health class that sugar and fat are not so good, and then the person cuts out those foods with the best intentions and all of a sudden has anorexia sometime later. And on the other hand, there are people who maybe have been maltreated, abused, have very bad body image, and that has an effect on their eating. And then they also end up, so to speak, with the same symptoms of anorexia nervosa with weight loss. So there must be something biological that ties them together. So I think there must be something biological that is a vulnerability, maybe of some genetic sort, that they then go into that direction of getting the eating disorder. So it starts with this initial drive to change your eating. And what then happens is you lose weight, and that has psychologically often the effect that people get sort of a cognitive reinforcer, right? So, you look good and you look fit and things like that. So it becomes something very desirable to lose weight. And the weight loss, however, is then associated with all these body changes, the gut hormone changes, the body signals, boy, you don't have enough food, your sugar level is low, you should eat. the sex hormones get very low, cortisol, a stress hormone, goes up, and various neurotransmitters in the brain, like serotonin, dopamine, they then get low because you just don't eat enough of those proteins, amino acids to make those neurotransmitters. And on the other hand, when these neurotransmitters go low, the receptors that they work on, they get very sensitized. And all those changes in the bodily area, so to speak, is to stimulate eating. And for instance, you can think about it, the dopamine in the brain that responds to unexpectancy around you gets quite sensitive, the system, and just think about there's famine, there's no food around, and then all of a sudden there are some red berries. You really want to be very responsive and reactive to those berries and go for them and eat them. So what you have then is, on your psychological level, I call it the conscious motivation. You have a conscious motivation that says, I want to lose weight, I want to cut out food. On the unconscious motivation level, sort of these body functions, they say, feed me. So they give the opposite signal, so to speak. Now, going from the conscious motivation to lose weight to then having anorexia nervosa, I think there is a step that involves genetic predisposition. We know that folks with anorexia, but in eating disorders in general, they tend to be more anxious. They tend to be worrying more. They also tend to be more perfectionistic.
There's a bunch of people out there right now who are all nodding their heads, myself included.
And, I want to say, these are all important traits. There's nothing wrong with those traits, right? People who worry a little bit more, they stay out of trouble. People who are very perfectionistic, they get better grades. They may get better jobs and so forth. So these, in many ways, very good traits. They just can get in the way when you, for instance, hear you should cut out food and stuff like that, and then you do it really perfectly. And then it becomes a very, very important aspect of your thinking. You're very afraid of not accomplishing this goal. And then you develop sort of the state of very high drive for thinness, very high body dissatisfaction. You start being afraid of losing control, right? Because even you may not be at a high weight, you're maybe at a low weight, but the problem is you could gain weight, right? And you could go up to a high body weight. So that's then where the anorexia part starts, where this thinking gets sort of locked in, I want to say. Now, think about, you have one part in the body that says, OMG, I do not want to gain any weight. I really want to lose weight. But you have another part in the body that says, feed me. What do you think that is? It creates a terrible conflict.
Right. Anxiety, distress.
Exactly. Anxiety, distress. Really, really terrible. This then, as you say, it triggers anxiety and it triggers doing more of the same, right? Not eating as much and avoiding the bad outcome, so to speak. Now, the question is, how can people, while they are maybe already underweight, how can they not let it happen that they eat? How can they sort of withstand a drive to eat? Because most people wouldn't even be able to do that. And what we have found is an interesting mechanism in the brain, and that is there's a brain part called the hypothalamus. It disintegrates sort of your bodily messages, like if you're hungry, if you're warm, if you're thirsty, things like that, and then feeds this information up to your more conscious brain areas to get a blanket, to get some water, get some food or whatnot. What we found in folks with eating disorders, including anorexia, is this circuitry that typically goes from the hypothalamus upwards to the ventral striatum and then further went into the opposite direction in folks with anorexia nervosa.
So what does that mean for the lay audience?
Exactly. So that was the question. What could that mean? Now, here's something what basic science has found. Let's think you are in the woods and you eat something, and all of a sudden the tiger is in front of you, right? Then the question is, should I keep eating? Or should I stop eating really fast and run away really fast, right? And the more sensible thing is to stop eating and run. The mechanism, how you can do this, the mechanism that you immediately stop eating because there's something more important and run seems to be in the circuitry from the ventral striatum to the hypothalamus. So in that direction. And that circuitry is anxiety driven, and it also is associated with brain dopamine function. And what our studies so far suggest is that this high anxiety about eating too much, gaining weight, and so forth, this might in fact trigger this mechanism to then override, so to speak, the drive to eat. Kind of a mind over matter principle.
Yeah, I'm just relating this back to working with patients in my practice and thinking about how the biological mechanisms, as we learn to understand them better, can be so validating for people to hear about. Why, when they're working so hard to recover and are experiencing all the work of recovery as being incredibly difficult and feeling impossible sometimes, and you're talking about there are actual neuroscience explanations as to why that might be.
Exactly. And this becomes a self-reinforcing or positive feedback loop to further eat less while you already lost weight because you're so anxious. Now you lose weight. The body even more says, feed me. And then your anxiety gets even worse. And we all know, right? People may lose weight and it's never good enough because the anxiety gets even worse and stresses you even more out about the possibility to gain any weight.
Well, and I'm wondering too, and maybe this is just off base, but I had the thought about that sensitized dopamine response and thinking about how culturally it's so rewarded for people to lose weight anyway, that maybe that contributes to that feedback loop too, that it's just another place where that's weight loss equals good outcome for people.
Exactly. So there is the anorexia type of motivation that's sort of then really difficult to get from. There is the bodily unconscious motivation, but the original motivation, like eating healthier, to losing weight, to be maybe more fit, maybe not to fill the body as much for whatever reason, also still exists. So this original motivation also still reinforces this cycle of losing weight.
Tell us a little bit about what happens to the brain during recovery, and then when we've looked at research studies that have examined patients who identify as being in recovery or recovered.
Yeah, so many of the neuroendocrine changes like gut hormones, sex hormones, and so forth, they normalize actually quite quickly in the course of weight normalization.
Which is good news.
And this is really good news, absolutely. The changes in the brain reward system, which, as far as we can tell, has a lot to do with the brain neurotransmitter dopamine, does not recover that quickly. So we did a study in adolescents before and after weight gain, about 6 weeks apart, and their brain response was pretty much the same as they were when they just entered treatment. On the other hand, we also studied a group of women who had long-term recovered from anorexia nervosa, and there was very little alteration or abnormality or whatever you want to call it left. So in that, I think, is really good news, right?
Yeah.
And I think you can recover and good brain, so to speak, they can go back to normal, which is just fantastic. The problem is it just may take a long time. It takes a long time and really hard work to get out of this state.
Yes, and we've been talking about this, but I'll lay the question out there explicitly just to reiterate for people. But what are those biological explanations for why making behavioral changes in recovery is so hard?
So I think it becomes a vicious cycle of fear of weight gain, losing weight, the body giving messages, feed me, but this bodily message, feed me, makes you cognitive, emotionally very, very frightened. And that is stronger than what the body says. and then you override, so to speak, this eating drive.
Mm-hmm.
And again, just the possibility of gaining weight is so terrifying that you rather go that route. A former patient of mine made a picture for me once when we parted, when she finished treatment, and that was a person made out of the word trust.
Mm.
And I think that was an incredibly important perspective that she showed there, because I think a lot has to do with gradually learning to trust your body can handle the food, gradually trusting in many other things in life and being able to handle things. And parallel to that, the body chemistry, so to speak, the brain chemistry has to normalize to make that even possible.
And the way to help normalize that is to repair those restrictive patterns and to feed yourself adequately.
That's really rule number one. If you don't do that, it's just very difficult because you cannot get out of this state, right?
Mm-hmm. I know that your research, or at least from what I've read, focuses primarily on people who have diagnoses of anorexia. I'm curious about how all of this works for people who have, quote, atypical anorexia, a term which I hate, who are suffering from restrictive symptoms, but don't happen to be in that low body weight that we use clinically for diagnostic purposes.
So this is a really good question, and we have recruited folks who are not quite as underweight. And we see that their brain chemistry seems less altered, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
They look more like the control group folks, but they nevertheless suffer a lot,
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm very glad, actually. It's not atypical, right? It's now called other specified of anorexia, bulimia type. And I'm really glad that there's more of an understanding and a recognition of that. Same with bulimia, nervosa, binge eating disorder. There we probably have to look at then different brain function. We're currently recruiting for a study in binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa to find out, so what is it exactly that drives these binges, right? The opposite what the person with restricting type anorexia nervosa does.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. And I want to reinforce for people who are listening that what you just said doesn't mean that they are not affected. In fact, you said you recognize that they are dealing with difficulties too. It sounds like it just has a different effect, and that maybe there may be a little bit of a protective aspect to not being severely underweight.
Possibly. So we're just getting there, I did look at data. It's not published yet. It's sort of in the getting ready stages, where we looked at folks who had sort of this other specified type of anorexia nervosa diagnosis. And I mean, cognitive emotionally, they were also very stressed. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And just to add that, I'm so glad that there's now a formal accepted diagnosis for binge eating disorder.
Yeah.
Because this is also a terrible struggle to get out of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that that's a little bit outside of the population that you typically research. I wonder if you can summarize a little bit of what we know about binge eating disorder, the effects on the brain, and then the recovery from that. I know that's an enormous question, but any knowledge is appreciated.
Yeah, I cannot say very much. The body of research on binge eating disorder is, in terms of neurobiology, is very small.
Mm-hmm.
And our study is probably going to be the largest in that era or area. And we just have started about 1.5 years ago. So we're still in the process of doing this study. But what is really, really important is the effects of stress and the effects of sadness, anxiety.
Mm.
And these are usually the triggers that set off the binge. These are usually sort of situations where you can't help yourself, right? And for instance, food, we know that from animal studies, it reduces the sort of noradrenaline level, the stress level in the brain, so it helps you feel better. There's a clear biology behind that. So very understandable. I would expect that the stress then interacts with this dopamine system that we have been talking about and then trigger the overeating. But how it exactly works, I have to defer in hopefully 3 years when we have more data to really support a hypothesis or a model.
I'm excited for that research body to grow. And that's, I think, in part connected to the fact that binge eating disorder, unfortunately, was not listed as its own formal separate diagnosis until the most recent edition of our diagnostic manual. And that's part of what accounts for the lack of research in that area. But I'm really glad that that's being addressed more now, too.
Yeah. One thing I would like to mention is this model for how the brain interacts with this psychological, emotional aspects has just been published as a model, and I made it so that it's freely available to anyone. It's been published in Physiology and Behavior, and the title is Motivation to Eat and Not to Eat, the Psychobiological Conflict in Anorexia Nervosa. So if you were to put that in your search engine, then you should find that relatively easily.
Awesome. And if you have a link for that, I'll link that in the show notes for everybody so they can just click on it from their podcast listening app, and then you can look at that. What are some of the surprising findings from the research literature about recovery from an eating disorder that people probably aren't aware of?
I'm not sure if I should say surprising, but it's just striking to me how consistent the results from our research has been. And how consistently we have shown how this reward system gets hypersensitive, which I think is the normal response to food restriction, and that then takes quite a while to normalize. What has been also very striking was the relationship we found then between this brain response and anxiety, and this anxiety was correlated with drive for thinness and body satisfaction, so positively driving those things. And on the other hand, this brain response was negatively correlated with weight gain and treatment. So it seemed like this brain alteration, this adaptation to low weight, the worse it was, the more it got in the way with normal weight gain.
I'm curious what's meant by the variable treatment in that statement.
So the folks that we have worked with, they are in a highly controlled environment. They're either here at Children's Hospital or we work with ED Cares together, and they're all in a highly structured environment where weight gain is important part, is the main part during treatment, and we know exactly how much they eat and so forth. And so we could see over a 5, 6, 7 week period how much weight somebody has gained, and then looked whether this change in weight gain has been related to the brain response.
I see. What are some of the research questions or projects you've been working on lately? Tell us about that.
So the project we're working on lately is to a large degree this new study where we try to understand how does stress, how does emotion interact with brain response to trigger binge eating? How does that maybe affect the dopamine system, with the idea if we find more specific relationships, then we can find biological treatments that could ameliorate the situation. That's really, again, supporting the psychotherapy is really my main goal. The other really, I think, exciting aspect of my research is we just studied a very large group of folks with eating disorders and controls, and we have about 400 people altogether. And I'm hoping that with this amount of data that we are able to come up with a classification that is maybe more biologically based than symptom based, so to speak, as it is in the classification system at this point. So can we categorize folks maybe particularly based on how sensitive they are to reward or punishment or things like that, together with a brain correlate, with a biological correlate, and then based on that, maybe identify people who need specific treatment module for a certain type of behavior. That might get in the way.
That's very interesting, actually. I wonder, too, because we didn't get much of a chance to talk about this yet, but not only are you a really well-respected, prolific researcher in this area, but you're also a clinician. You have a lot of training in therapy. Will you tell us a little bit about your clinical experiences working with people who have eating disorders and what you've taken away from your years of doing that work?
Yeah, I worked initially with mostly adults with different types of eating disorders and was trained formally in CBT primarily, but also at various other trainings. It was interesting, by the way, when I first started, I thought, shouldn't I start in depression or anxiety or something like that, in this work? But then I found it very fitting as a start because in anorexia and nervosa, it's almost like for some, not for all, but for some, an existential question, like, can I deal with the hassles in life? And how do I do that? And then I sort of in the past 12 years, I've been working at Children's Hospital Colorado and working with youth. It's been very striking to see kids who are 8 years old by now already struggling with that.
It's so
the influence,
sad. It's just so
it
sad.
really is.
Yeah.
Yes. And the influence of the internet is there. So I remember a kid, I met her when she was 10, and she told me, when she was 5 years old, she already looked at bodies of thin people on the internet. So it's really dramatic. What we have seen is that therapy, especially in sort of family-based interventions in youth, is really important. I think the kids should not be a long time away from home. I think they should go back home as soon as possible. And it's really important to engage the parents to do so. So that they can be the therapist at home in a way, at least with meal support and things like that. And I think that is really, really important and helpful for a long-term improvement. And the other thing, what is striking to me is what we have seen more and more, also because there's now a diagnosis for it, is the so-called avoidant restrictive food intake disorder.
Yes.
Where folks just don't have an appetite. And some are afraid of swallowing, others not. Some just, for many, it's entirely unclear why it is so hard. And I think that is a wide open field for us to learn more. What is behind that and how can we help those kids, adults, and their families better?
Yeah, and that's an area, at least to my knowledge right now, that does not have a lot of research behind it because, again, it's just something that we're beginning to understand and now has its own separate diagnostic category. And I'm curious to see what we wind up learning about it because it would be interesting to explore how biology can inform the treatment approaches we use for people who have different presenting concerns.
Yeah.
So through all of your work with research and with working with patients clinically, what would you want people who are listening now who are trying to recover to know?
I would ask you to stick with your treatment and don't give up. I would like to ask you to use medication where it can be helpful. I always think what is easier to juggle one ball or 3 or 4 balls? The eating disorder is already hard enough if you have a lot of anxiety and depression, which then become also their own entity if they hadn't been there before the eating disorder even, then they just make everything even worse and even more complicated. So I'm a pragmatist. I always like to tell families, whatever is safe and works. I was a therapist. I'm happy to treat people with psychotherapy, but the reality is this is often just not enough. And it just takes too long, and it's about quality of life, right? So I think you want to do whatever you can.
That's a good point. And I like the pragmatic approach that you have to that and thinking about how it could kind of reduce the struggle overall. And I guess I just want to echo back to some of the things that you said toward the beginning for people, because I try to end on a note that's pretty hopeful, not because it's a bunch of BS, but because the research keeps telling us there is reason for hope. And clinically, our experiences keep telling us there's reason for hope. And one of the things you're saying is that when people go through recovery from an eating disorder, their brain does recover too.
That's what it looks like. And, I have seen many people who have clearly recovered. I worked in many research studies that recruited folks who were recovered. So yes, it's possible. Absolutely.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Frank, for taking the time to be on the podcast today. We really appreciate your perspective. I know that you're very busy and I admire so much your work and all the work that you continue to do. So thank you for taking the time to talk with us today and break down some very complicated stuff in a way that's easy for us to understand.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a true pleasure, and anytime again.
Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.